In this presentation, I want to give you a little more information and help you in completing the performance-based assessment. And the purpose of this assignment is to develop a realistic, usable, standards-based assessment rubric. And this should be designed so that anyone, regardless of their content knowledge or background, should be able to understand the rubric and administer it with some reliability and consistency. Regardless if you're a physical education teacher or not, you will follow the 5-step process identified in the Physical Education Framework for Public Schools. So the first step is to read Chapter 5 of the framework. This chapter covers assessment, reviews the different types of assessments used, and explains the 5-step process for creating a standards-based assessment. Next, you will identify a skill and/or a standard to assess. And I say or because not everyone is a physical education teacher. If you are a physical education teacher, you can approach this one of two ways. You can select a standard first and then focus on a skill within that standard to develop an assessment for, or you can think of your skill first and then locate a standard that is aligned to that skill. And physical education teachers should align their skill to either the national standards or the California state standards. You can also use your local state standards if you're not in California. Now, do not select a standard and a skill that the framework has already provided an example for. You must develop your own. If you are a coach, you can select one of NASP's coaching standards. And these, other than coaching standard number 6, really don't address specific skills. So if coaches are having difficulty selecting a standard or domain related to a skill, it's acceptable to focus on a performance-based skill and then develop your assessment from there. Again, do not select a skill that is already provided in the framework. You can select one of 3 areas to assess. Number 1, as I mentioned before, a skill. And this can be something that is specifically related to a game or a sport that you want your students to know. Things such as how to throw a frisbee, how to bat in baseball, or how to dribble. A good way to approach it is to think of a sport and then think of the skills needed to participate in that sport. And then you select one of those skills to assess. You can also select a fitness component to assess. And this would be any one of the health-related or performance-related components, including cardiovascular fitness, muscle strength, muscle endurance, flexibility, agility, balance, power, speed, coordination, or even reaction time. Or you can identify a behavior to assess. And this is a bit more difficult to develop a rubric for, but it is possible. A behavioral component would include things such as participation, which is difficult to measure, cooperation, kindness, teamwork, or even helpfulness. Now, while all of these are acceptable choices for developing a rubric for, I would recommend focusing on a specific skill, but again, any of these 3 is fine. An example of this would be the student will be able to perform an underhand toss for accuracy using a variety of manipulatives demonstrating a mature form. And in this example, there are 2 things that need to be accounted for. Number 1, accuracy, and 2, the mature form of an underhand toss. In order to effectively assess this, a clear and specific description of a mature underhand toss must be provided, and the guidelines for accuracy could vary. Another example would be the athlete will be able to complete an accurate football pass demonstrating proper form and control to a laterally running receiver. Again, here, a specific description of the proper form and control for passing a football must be provided. It's another skill to accurately pass the ball to a running receiver. And keep in mind that this assessment focuses only on the passing and not the receiving of the ball. Another example that I've seen very often is something like this. The student will demonstrate the correct form for completing a free throw, making 7 out of 10 attempts. This is, in my opinion, a poor objective for an assessment, especially at a very young age. Generally, teachers will make the assessment simple by focusing on the outcome. In this example, 7 out of 10 attempts is that example. So depending on how many attempts were successful, a grade can easily be attached to this performance. Unfortunately, this does not assess the skill, but the outcome. There are some professional athletes who cannot complete 7 out of 10 free throw attempts. So why would we use this criterion to assess a student? I would discourage you from including an outcomes-based criterion in your rubric. You want to focus on and teach or assist in the development of a particular skill that is observable that you can assess. The next step for you is to understand the 5-step process in assessing and follow the model provided in the framework. The 5-step process is as follows. Number 1, unpack or explain the standard or expectation. This means that you should clarify the content of the standard or expectation. Identify the verb and the content of the standard. Describe and explain exactly what the student or athlete will do. Number 2 is determine the evidence. Explain exactly how the student or athlete will demonstrate proficiency. What is the evidence that must be provided to determine mastery of this particular objective? That's the question you need to answer. This is your performance-based objective statement. Here, you'll always begin with the quote, "the student will," and then continue from there. This is where you will provide a clear, detailed, step-by-step description or explanation as to what you're looking for. In step 3, you select or design your assessment tool. Now, Chapter 5 of the framework identified several different assessment tools for different purposes. For our purposes here, you can simply state, and I quote this, "the assessment tool used will be a rubric." That's all you need to put for number 3. Number 4, or step 4, determine the criteria for competence. Describe what is required for an exceptional performance, and as well as less exceptional. What would the best performance look like? As a teacher or a coach, what would the student or athlete do to demonstrate that they have performed at the required expectation? For example, if you were assessing a student in a basic jump rope performance, you may look for how the student determines the effectiveness or length of the rope, how the rope is held, whether or not the wrist or arms are used, whether or not the student jumps off their toes, how high the jump is, whether or not the knees are bent, and so on and so on. Lastly, in step 5, you will describe the levels of quality. In this section, determine what your levels of performance will be. Will you use grades, A through F? Will you use standards-based language, something like exceeding the standards or far below the standard? Or will you use points? In other words, what scale are you using to determine the outcome of performance? Each of these steps should be used as a heading, followed by your complete and detailed description and/or example. Remember, write everything out using complete, comprehensive, detailed, and thoughtful sentences. You will also provide a brief description or statement as to how you can address the cognitive and affective domains related to your skill. For an example of using the 5-step process to develop a rubric, watch part 2 of the presentation.